Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Before we continue, I need to say something. While recording and editing this video, Vincent Pastore, the actor who played Big Pussy Bompancero, passed away at the age of 80. Vincent had a long career, going all the way back to Goodfellas and Carlito's Way. His first acting credit was a film called Black Roses that came out in 1988. The Sopranos would not have been the same without Vincent. My favorite moment of his in the whole show is when he asked Chrissy, "You know who else had an arc? Noah." No matter how many times I rewatch this show, it always makes me laugh. When Vincent was funny, no one was funnier. What was your favorite Vincent Pastore moment in the show? Leave a comment below if you'd like to share. Vincent was a phenomenal guy and a phenomenal actor, and I'd like to dedicate this episode of my rewatch to his memory. Rest in peace, Vincent. You will not be forgotten. Bunanima. I'm continuing my Sopranos rewatch today with Season 1, Episode 7, Down Neck, which originally aired on February 21st, 1999. The episode's title, Down Neck, refers to a neighborhood in Newark, which is seen in the late 1960s through several flashbacks. This episode is the first one written by writing duo Mitchell Burgess and Robin Green, who in real life are married and often work together. They wrote 22 episodes of The Sopranos in total, which is 25% of the entire show. They also worked as producers on the show for 70 episodes, which is over 80%. They also both worked as writers on Northern Exposure, an early 90s show. David Chase worked on that show as a producer, which is presumably where he met them. Mitchell and Robin later went on to create the show Blue Bloods in 2010. This is also the first and only episode directed by a female director, Lorraine Senna Ferrara, though she's credited here as Lorraine Senna, which I reckon is her maiden name. Just like Mitchell and Robin, she also worked on Northern Exposure. She directed 2 episodes of that show. How did the combo of writing team Mitchell and Robin and Lorraine's solo directing venture on The Sopranos turn out? Let's find out. Characters. There are some new characters in this episode introduced in flashbacks to the 1960s. This is the first appearance of Joseph Saravo as Johnny Boy Soprano, Tony's father. He has a recurring role and shows up in flashbacks in later seasons. He's credited with 5 episodes over the course of the entire show. Joseph Cerveo was also in Carlito's Way, a 1993 film. This is also the first appearance of Janish and Barbara, Tony's older and younger sisters. This is the only appearance of Madeline Blue as young Janish. Janish shows up later, but this is the only time we see her in a flashback at this particular age. In Season 3, her character shows up in a flashback in the episode Fortunate Son, but either due to casting or to portray her at a different age, she's portrayed by actress Juliet Fox at that point. Character PTO. There's no Paulie this episode. In fact, we haven't seen him since Meadowlands, but he'll return in the next episode. For existing characters, there's a lot going on here. Carmela blames both Tony and herself for AJ's behavioral problems, going so far as to say that she can see with her own 2 eyes. This echoes what she told Father Phil in episode 5 about knowing the kind of man Tony is, but marrying him anyway, only realizing and regretting the consequences now that it's affecting her children and it's too late. This is something Carmela seems to do to avoid any kind of accountability or blame for anything she does. She halfway blames herself, portraying herself as a victim, while also shifting blame to Tony to absolve herself at the same time. This reminds me a lot about the conversation she has with Dr. Krakauer in Season 3. Carmela enjoys the benefits and lifestyle Tony's life of crime makes possible, but denies any responsibility for enabling him. For Uncle Junior, this episode shows him in both the past and the present, though much of his characterization is done in the flashbacks. He talks to young Tony about baseball. If you recall the prior episode, Pax Soprana, they met at a Little League baseball game to talk about business, so their shared love of America's pastime goes back at least 3 decades. We also briefly see Junior playing catch with Tony when he was a child, something he mentions in the pilot episode when he asks, "How many hours did I spend playing catch with you?" Rocco Sisto plays Uncle Junior in the 1967 flashbacks in this episode. Rocco returns for 2 more episodes, one in Season 3 and one in Season 6, to again portray Uncle Junior in the past. For Livia, we also see her in both the past and the present. In the past, we see just how toxic she was as a mother. We also see how dramatic she was towards both her husband and her children, especially when she talks Johnny out of moving to Nevada and threatens to smother her own children before she lets Johnny take them away from her. She even threatens Tony when he keeps badgering her to buy him an accordion. In the present, she interprets Tony going to a therapist as an attack on her as his mother, and although she tells Tony he only remembers what he wants to remember, she seems to be projecting her own dysfunction onto him. And when she denies any involvement in stopping Johnny from moving to Nevada, she's blame-shifting as it's called in the world of psychology. Lila Robbins plays young Livia in this episode. She reprises this role in the Season 3 episode Fortunate Son. But more than anything else, this is an episode about fathers and sons. For AJ, that means a continuation of a character arc that began in episode 4, Meadowlands, in which AJ learned that his father is a mobster. Tony's attempts to find out, if anything, only confirm this beyond any remaining doubt. Interestingly, AJ doesn't tell his father that Fielder told him about their father's line of work and instead says that it's kids from school. Given that AJ found a website accusing Jackie Sr. of ripping off a pension fund, I wonder if that influenced his decision to steal communion wine. It's likely inconsequential compared to the crimes of his father. AJ's early dialogue is something I thought about after rewatching this episode. He tells his friends he won't mention stealing communion wine when he next goes to confession. This is a bit of a parallel with Tony, who eventually has to tell his children that he's a mobster. But the full extent of his crimes likely won't be mentioned based upon what he tells Fielder in college, about some of his money coming from illegal sources, hardly the half of what he really does on a daily basis. But unlike the mobsters who have so far evaded consequences, AJ is grounded and not allowed to play Mario Kart, the game Tony and him played in Meadowlands. And unlike most of the other characters in this episode, AJ doesn't blame someone else for his choices, though like Livy, he does try to lie to escape consequences, which doesn't work for him. When he says at the end of the episode that it isn't fair, he's totally got that right. AJ's main arc here, about fathers and sons, raises the question of whether he'll follow in his father's footsteps or break the Sopranos family curse. Like most Sopranos episode, there's a huge amount of character development for Tony. Ever since the pilot episode, Tony and Melfi have regularly discussed the ducks and their symbolic meaning, the underlying fear Tony has of losing his family. Episode 5, College, showed how Fielder, long suspected her father's involvement in the mafia before asking him about it. Tony's inability to continue lying about this has forced him to confront the reality that inevitably, his children will learn about his line of work, and the reaction might not be entirely accepting. This detail is explored with one of the great writing techniques used by The Sopranos. Tony talks to other members of his crew, and these other characters embody the different possible outcomes. Silvio's daughter disapproves of her father's line of work, whereas for Big Puss, they know but they love him anyway. This illustrates to Tony both his hope and his fear. He hopes his children will be accepting like Big Puss is, but fears that they could instead reject him, like Sil's daughter. This prompts Tony to recollect his past and how he found out about his own father's involvement in organized crime, and his relationship with his own father. This takes us down the rabbit hole with Jefferson Airplane to the Down Neck neighborhood of Newark in 1967. Much of Tony's backstory is told through these flashbacks, such as the troublesome relationship he has with both his sister and his mother. The focal point, though, is when Tony recalls how he found out his own father was a mobster. Tony's father and Junior beating up Rocco mirrors Tony and Christopher beating up Mahaffey in the pilot. And to me, this adds significance to Tony screaming at Mahaffey about him going around telling everyone that Tony is nothing compared to the guys who used to run North Jersey, given how Mahaffey is trying to pull a fast one the same way Rocco did, and how, whether conscious or subconscious, Tony is comparing himself to Johnny Boy. Highly allegorical. The sacred and the pot pain. I'm kind of surprised Tony didn't find this out earlier, considering that he didn't walk very far from his home to witness this. Johnny Boy worked the same neighborhood he lived in. Given what we see of Newark in the present day, I'm not certain if Tony moved his family to the suburbs due to the old neighborhood being less Italian-friendly, or if Tony is trying to keep his business and family life separate. He also sees his father arrested, which shatters young Tony's illusion of his father being tough and invincible, though he's released a short time later. This is echoed in Tony's own life in Season 2 when he's arrested in front of Fielder, but released in time for her graduation. This also shows the dynamic between Tony, Johnny Boy, and Junior after Johnny Boy's death. Tony has become the son that Junior never had, and Junior becomes the closest thing Tony has to a father figure. Bobby Borello plays young Tony during these flashbacks. This is the only Sopranos episode for him. Tony does have flashbacks later in the series, but just like Janish, a different actor is used to portray him when he's a little bit older, but still not an adult. One point Livia raises is when she tells Tony that he only remembers what he wants to remember. Also, when Melfi initially asks Tony about his father, he asks, "Who remembers?" Maybe Olivia has a point. It's also notable that Tony is not always honest with the people closest to him, including Carmela and Melfi. Could he also be dishonest with himself? His memories of the past catch Livia as awful, while also portraying his father as a good guy, at least relative to Livia's behavior. I couldn't help but notice how Tony admits to Melfi that his father was physically abusive with him and his sisters by beating them with a belt, though no such event is present in any flashback. Yet Tony's memory of his mother threatening him is quite vividly on display. There's also a detail in the pilot that's relevant to this. When Tony tells Carm that he's seeing a therapist, Carmela reminds Tony that it's not just Tony's mother who was abusive, but also Tony's father. Why does Carmela have to remind him? Is Tony seeing his dead father through rose-colored glasses? Is it because of his nostalgia that he selectively forgets his father's bad moments and only remembers the good ones? At the end of the season, he says as much to his children, remember the good times. A more morbid psychological interpretation is that Tony fails to acknowledge his father's abusive and evil actions because if he did, he would have to confront his own awful behavior. And by excusing the sins of his father, he's able to commit the same ones without holding himself accountable or embracing cognitive dissonance. Regardless of the reasons, Tony's memories of the past may not be entirely accurate, and this impacts his conclusions about his mother, as well as whether the job Rocco offered Johnny Boy was serious or not. In this last rewatch, the most subtle thing I noticed is how favoritism is a huge factor in how Tony sees the past, present, and future. In the flashbacks, Tony recounts how he wasn't just upset that his father went to Rideland without him, but that his father took Janish and not him. And when young Tony begs with his mother for an accordion, he laments that if Janish wanted one, she'd get one. Libby then tells him that's because Janish does as she's told, and when Johnny Boy is released from jail, he brings Tony ice cream, but his undivided attention is directed towards Janish, leaving Tony to eat his ice cream by himself. In the present, Tony and Carmelo blame each other over AJ's ADD, and Tony is quick to retort by mentioning Fielder being a daddy's girl, as well as being a prospective college student and in the National Honor Society. This is the emotional core of this episode. As a parent, Tony favors Fielder, who is more like Tony in a lot of ways. But as a child, Tony remembers what it is like to be neglected and made to feel like the child of a lesser god. Lots of children feel this way, and it's an all too common family dynamic. But one thing I want to point out is I've studied psychology and minored in it in the university. In fact, I have a semester and a half of psychology. And in households with narcissistic parents, there is often a golden child and a scapegoat. In other words, one child is the favorite and the other is a pariah. In normal families, this doesn't happen, or at least not to the pathological degree that Libya does. Ultimately, this drives Tony's very real concern for AJ's future. And when Tony complains that it isn't fair, and Tony responds, "You got that right," it's clear from Tony's own past that he knows just how unfair it really is. And in spite of that, Tony makes an effort to bond with AJ as best he can in the ways he knows how. Unlike Tony's own father, who gives him ice cream and then ignores him, Tony makes sundaes and shares both the ice cream and his time with his own son. Guest stars. For guest stars, there's a notable cameo appearance of Michael B. Jordan as one of the young guys who confronts Tony about littering in one of the flashbacks. Michael went on to star in The Wire, another HBO show, and is also known for starring in Black Panther and Creed. This is the only appearance of Tim Williams as the gym teacher, Mr. McKesham. This is also the only appearance of David Beach as Peter Galani. David did guest star many years later in an episode of Blue Bloods, the show created by the writers of this episode. I reckon they liked working with him. Now, it's time to talk about the plot. Though I've never had the makings of a varsity plotter, which is a tremendous blow to my self-esteem. For this episode, I'm separating the interwoven plot lines into past, present, and future. The past, Johnny Boy Soprano. The past plotline focuses on Tony and his father, Johnny Boy Soprano. This plotline begins when Tony takes his Prozac. White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane plays as Tony goes down the rabbit hole of his memories to 1967. Uncle Junior pulls up in a car and tells young Tony about Joey Peppertone hitting 3 RBIs. Not 3, but 3 RBIs. Johnny Boy tells Tony to pay attention in school and do well. Tony misses the school bus. He runs after it, but it's almost like he doesn't have the makings of a varsity athlete. Later on, Tony sees that Janish and his father are going someplace, but he's not allowed to go. In order to find out, Tony later lies to his mother about going to the CYO and hides inside the trunk of his father's car to find out where his father and Janish have been going. He finds out his father has been secretly taking Janish to Rideland, an amusement park. Uncle Junior is there too. And next time he takes the bus. He arrives just in time to witness the state police arrest his father and a bunch of other mobsters. Tony quickly determines that his father was using Janish as a front to conceal the fact that he was conducting illegal activities. This is ironic given how Tony used Fielder's college trip to conceal whacking Fabian the rat. Although that wasn't really his plan initially or all along. It just happened to be a good cover story for what he was doing. I like the detail of the clothes rack there, like they had stolen clothing and were going to fence it, just like Brendan and Christopher in 46 Long. Young Tony ends up freaking out since his tough guy father looks helpless in handcuffs. He goes home dejected, and Lydia tells Tony that Johnny Boy isn't guilty. The police just pick on Italians, something young Tony even then knew was a lie. But before long, his father returns home with ice cream for Tony. Rocco, the guy Johnny Boy beat up earlier, congratulates Johnny. In fact, later, Rocco asks Johnny to go to Nevada and go into business with him. It's an idea that Livia is determined to stop Johnny from even considering, going so far as to threaten to smother the children before she lets him take them halfway across the country. Livia's toxic behavior has the intended effect of keeping Johnny Boy stuck in New Jersey and in his mafia life. Present. Tony's plot begins at a worksite where Christopher and him are shaking down a foreman for protection money. At dinner at the Sopranos home, Livia and Junior are having dinner with the family. I think this is the first time we see this. AJ has gotten into some trouble at school, and Livia and Junior remind Tony that he was quite the little rascal himself when he was a child, such as stealing a car when he was 10 and stealing lobsters and selling them on Bloomfield Avenue. When Tony protests, Livia tells Tony that he only remembers what he wants to remember. Ironically, none of Tony's behavior shows up in the 1960s flashbacks, so she might have a point. At therapy, Melfi and Tony discuss Tony telling her in the prior episode that he's in love with her. Melfi wants to know how he's doing with it. Tony then attempts to taunt Melfi about him having a 24-year-old Russian Gumar on the side, but Melfi stays cool and professional. Melfi then asks Tony if he feels like his father is responsible for what Tony has become. Tony again brings up the fact that he's not selling patio furniture in San Diego. Not sure what his obsession with patio furniture is. Maybe it has something to do with his swimming pool and the ducks. Kind of interesting he mentioned San Diego, since this is the first episode in which we learn that Janish went to California to escape from the toxicity of the Sopranos family. Maybe Tony secretly wishes that he had done the same, instead of falling into the same trap as Johnny Boy, who never moved out west to pursue his dreams of a better life. Melfi then asks him about his early anxieties about the ducks and if AJ finding out about Tony being a mobster is the source of that underlying fear. She then reminds Tony about his love of history, and how those who don't understand it are doomed to repeat it. Tony then tells Melfi about an interaction with his mother during his childhood in which she threatened to harm him. Melfi's reaction to Tony telling her this shows just how messed up Livia is. Tony seems to think his mob life is due to elements beyond his control, and that it's hereditary, since he's not making pots in Peru. If he was, his father would probably import them wholesale. Melfi reminds him that predispositions aren't destiny. People can make choices, and this is America, given that the last episode of the series is called Made in America. Are Tony's choices made in America? I don't know. What do you think? At Green Grove, Junior visits Livia. Livia makes a remark about Tony being at Overbrook State Mental Hospital. Tony interrupts Livia before she can tell Junior about Tony seeing a shrink. As soon as Junior is out of earshot, Livia tells Tony that Junior is full of himself after being named Capo Regime. Tony asks Livia about the Alatoris, who are billionaires now, having moved to Reno in the 1960s and finding great success in their business ventures. Livia insists that Rocco was only getting Johnny all worked up about it, but Tony insists that Livia talked Johnny out of an opportunity. The subtext here is that Tony feels like Livia robbed both Johnny and Tony from a better life that was within reach. Livia cuts off his argument by suggesting Tony should talk to a psychiatrist if he wants to blame someone else for how his life turned out, and she denies that she had anything to do with it. Maybe Livia is the one who only remembers what she wants to remember. The future, AJ. AJ's long plotline begins with him and two friends stealing and drinking communion wine at Verbum Day, their Catholic high school. They're then sick at PE class. Tony and Carmela then get pulled into a parent-teacher conference. AJ is suspended for 3 days, and Dr. Galani, the school psychologist, wants to evaluate AJ for ADD. AJ has trouble following the rules, weighing consequences, and doesn't think before he acts. Tony's reaction here indicates that he knows where AJ got those behaviors from. Tony says all AJ needs is a whack upside the head. Dr. Galani asks the Sopranos if they hit their children, and he has a look of concerned horror not much different from Melfi's reaction to Tony's abuse at the hands of Livia. Tony implies that there's anti-Italian discrimination, the same excuse Livia used to excuse Johnny Boy's arrest. At dinner at the Sopranos home, Livia and Junior encourage AJ's bad behavior. Livia says it's outrageous AJ is suspended from a private school given how much money they pay to send him there. Junior says boys will be boys. Tony is very angry with this and doesn't want anyone encouraging AJ's bad behavior. AJ then says something that implies he knows that his family is mobbed up, and Carmela immediately tells AJ that he's grounded for all his misbehavior. AJ storms off all upset. I think his punishment is no Mario Kart, no television. In 1999, when I saw this, I thought AJ was being really melodramatic, since as a kid I got punishments like that if I so much as got a bad grade in a class. While getting ready for bed, Tony and Carmela discuss whether or not AJ could have ADD. Tony thinks AJ doesn't. Carmela worries that he does. This is one of the keys to the great writing of this show. Different characters often having different opinions in believable ways. Carmela also asks why Fielder is acting peculiar after their college trip. Whatever happened there. At therapy, Tony tells Melfi that he thinks ADD is BS. Why should he punish AJ if he has a disease? He asks Melfi, should he punish AJ or give him a break? Tony even offers her money for an answer, but Melfi doesn't have one. An interesting note here is that Tony asks Melfi if ADD is BS and just another excuse for shrinks to line their pockets, which is not too different than Livia's beliefs about psychiatry. At the Bing, Silvio says that doesn't sound like AJ. I'm not sure if he means the ADD or the stealing of the wine. Silvio and Big Puss discuss their own families and how their children know that their fathers are mobsters. Silvio's daughter is upset at her father running a strip club, whereas Big Puss's children love him anyway. Both mention how, in the then new information age of 1999, it's hard to hide the truth about anything. AJ then goes to Dr. Galani's evaluation, and AJ looks nervous when the doctor starts frantically scribbling. At home, Carmela has books to read in case AJ has ADD. Tony and her have an argument about whose fault AJ's behavior is, and like the mature adults that they are, each of them naturally blames the other. At Green Grove, Livia is reading obituaries. I recall a study from long ago that pessimists read obituaries first, whereas optimists read the comic strips first. I wonder which one Livia is. Someone who says it's all a big nothing is probably going to start with the obits. AJ visits Livia. She suggests playing Scrabble, which is probably a better game than Name That Pope. AJ tells Livia that he saw a psychiatrist and also spills the beans on Tony seeing one. Livia is shocked and makes it all about her, assuming Tony is complaining about her. She ends up sobbing while AJ indifferently eats a pear. While driving AJ to the dentist, Tony gets a flat tire. Tony takes the opportunity to ask AJ about his ADD evaluation. In a poetic twist, the same doctor-patient confidentiality that protects Tony's sessions with Melfi comes up as a boundary between Tony and AJ. Tony then asks AJ about what he knows about the family business. AJ mentions seeing the FBI at Uncle Jackie's funeral and the website Fielder showed him in denial, anger, acceptance, but he says that the kids at school said some stuff and doesn't mention his sister. At therapy, Tony is going crazy over what AJ does and doesn't know. Melfi and him discuss fate versus free will, whether AJ has ADD because it's something hereditary in the Sopranos family genes or not. Tony doesn't mind if AJ is proud of his father and what he does, but he doesn't want AJ to be like him. Melfi tells him genetics are not destiny and that people have a range of choices, and that this is America. Which is again ironic because the last episode is called Made in America. Is Tony's eventual fate due to choices he made in America? Tony and Carmela meet with the school psychiatrist, who tells them that AJ doesn't have ADD but is a borderline case, having 5 out of 9 criteria, and having 6 would have resulted in an ADD diagnosis. They argue with the teacher and Tony calls BS on him. AJ is a 13-year-old. He messed up and he's being punished, but he'll be fine. And Carmela insists that they don't pay for these ridiculous tests. At home, Tony is exercising while watching a documentary on Midway. Which reminds me that back in '99, the History Channel had history and wasn't running shows about treasure hunters and UFOs nonstop. AJ tells Tony that he's being grounded isn't fair. Tony tells him you got that right. Then they make ice cream sundaes while Jefferson Airplane plays again. So now it's time to talk about the themes. What was it all about? Or is it all big nothing? What makes me think I'm so special? The first theme I noticed is money, because it's mentioned so many times in this episode. This goes back to Tony's comments in the pilot episode about him reaching financial heights his father never could, at the cost of values such as loyalty being afterthoughts compared to back in the good times. Money can sometimes help in business or family life. Tony begs his mother for an accordion, which she refuses to buy for him. I wonder if this factors into Tony buying AJ a drum set later, since he never had the opportunity to pursue music when he was younger. Also, Johnny Boy brings young Tony cherry vanilla ice cream, something he clearly enjoys. The biggest money issue in this episode has to be Livia convincing Johnny to not take up Rocco's offer and move to Reno to go into business with him. Rocco's family are now billionaires according to Livia, and Tony resents the idea that his life could have been vastly different if his own mother didn't stand in the way of Johnny Boy escaping a life of organized crime. His anger really comes through when he's talking to Melfi about someone he knew long ago whose grandfather made millions by inventing salami ties, and he and his family don't have to work for a living. The subtext here is that Tony's anger is really about Livia messing up his future, leaving him with no choice but to live a life of crime. On this rewatch, I did notice that right after AJ steals communion wine, Tony's next scene is him driving to a construction site and shaking down a foreman for kickbacks. Both AJ and Tony are stealing. It not only shows that AJ could easily end up following Tony's footsteps, but what Tony has to do to put food on the table. His chance at something better was denied by someone who should have been looking out for his interests and well-being. But there are some things that money can't fix. Tony offers Melfi a raise if she can help him figure out how to discipline AJ properly. But no amount of money can allow Tony to outsource his job as a father. And revisiting AJ's wine theft, Tony offers to pay the school back for the stolen wine, but the priest-principal guy insists that stealing the sacramental wine is an affront to the Holy Sacrament. In other words, the principles, values, matter more than the monetary value of the wine. I wonder if there's a deeper symbolism going on here, given how Tony tells Melfi that AJ's ADD or whatever is the matter with him and his son are due to genetics, what's in the blood, and church wine is symbolic or literally the blood of Christ. But the blood of the Sopranos is cursed, an unholy inversion of the promise of redemption. Or maybe I need to discontinue the lithium. Silvio mentions at the Bing that his daughter doesn't approve of her father's line of work. She finds her father's job at the strip club to be demeaning, and even when Sil tells her how much money the strippers are making, she remains firm in her principles and values. Another theme is that of fate and free will. Livia's choice to stop Johnny Boy from moving out west dooms Tony to a life of crime, since it prevented the Sopranos from being in on something from the ground floor. And since this choice was made for Tony, it plays out in his life as destiny. This reminds me of something Tony mentioned in the pilot. When discussing the end of the good times, he talks about how it's best to be in on something from the ground floor, which is exactly how Johnny Boy describes the opportunity to move to Reno with Rocco, the chance to start in on something from the ground floor. At the same time, Tony has to acknowledge his responsibility to AJ, the fate he's creating for his own children. He may not have had a choice with the life his parents created for him, but he has a choice with the life he creates for AJ. One thing Tony mentions to Melfi is his feelings towards her. In the prior episode, he told her he was in love with her, and he tells her he can't just turn off his feelings. He also mentions how his mob life is something that he was born into, since he's not making pots in Peru or selling patio furniture in San Diego. Melfi attempts to present the alternative to Tony blaming fate for his circumstances, by mentioning that this is America and you have a choice. Many mob stories, such as The Godfather, present America and the American dream as an illusion of some sort, and how a person's past often follows them there because they bring the same behaviors with them. Wherever they go, there they are. It's also a theme in The Great Gatsby, where all of Gatsby's material possessions can't conceal the fact that he hasn't changed, he's the same guy. Dee, a character in The Wire, another HBO show, even observes that the books in Gatsby's library are all brand new and don't seem to have been read. But I won't go down this rabbit hole any further. That's what Jefferson Airplane is for. Does Tony have more free will than he's willing to accept? Back in the pilot, he told Melfi that Livia is his mother, and he has to take care of his mother. Tony's old-school values force him to remain loyal to family, even when he wishes at times that he could make a different decision. When Melfi asks Tony how he's dealing with her turning him down after he professes his feelings for her, Tony brings up his 24-year-old girlfriend, and he asks Melfi tauntingly how old she is and how she's dealing with the fact that he's dating a much younger woman. Unlike Tony, who feels compelled to act on his feelings, Melfi keeps her cool and remains professional. She's able to exercise a choice, and her choice is to control her feelings rather than allowing her feelings to control her. Another way to look at this instead of fate versus free will is, who is responsible? When Tony and Carmela meet with AJ's school principal, he asks if AJ is being punished because of his Italian last name. And when Johnny Boy is arrested by the police, Livia insists that Johnny didn't do anything wrong and he was only arrested because the police hate Italians. When Tony suggests that AJ needs a whack upside the head, Carmela scolds him about not punishing AJ if he has a disease, because if he has a disease, how can his behavior be his fault? Coincidentally, I've been reading Robert Hare's Without Conscience, which is about his studies of psychopathy. One of the topics he covers is the idea of who is responsible for a psychopath's behavior. It's an eternal question of whether someone is mad or bad. Do they understand right from wrong? Well, this may apply to Tony more than AJ, since Tony is more of a psychopath and AJ is suspected of having ADD. Robert Hare concluded that psychopaths are aware that what they are doing is wrong, but make a choice to do the wrong thing and justify it by blaming others or their circumstances instead of taking any responsibility. I think this relates a great deal to Melfi's opinion when she talks to Tony. Regardless of one's mental state, if they are legally sane, they have the freedom to make their own choices, but also the responsibility that comes with them. Tony blames his father, Johnny Boy, for choosing a criminal way of life, and his mother for interfering when his father had a chance to escape it. And when Carmela mentions that AJ might have inherited his mental illness, Tony is quick to blame Carmela's Uncle Lenny, whatever happened there. And ultimately the person Carmela blames is Carmela. She's going about in pity for herself. The last theme I thought was the theme of discrimination and oppression, and when it could provoke justifiable outrage. The flashbacks to 1967 include events surrounding the Newark riots, and if you read up on the historical background, the Newark riots were provoked by systemic racism. When one of the mobsters is being arrested and he tells the cops to go arrest the rioters burning down Newark, one of the things I thought about in this rewatch was the end of Revenge of the Sith, the Star Wars film. Lucas mentioned on the commentary that he intercut the scenes of Darth Vader murdering the Separatists alongside Palpatine ending democracy in the galaxy to explore how ironic it is that Palpatine's corruption is actually a worse crime than outright murder. And I wonder if organized crime done in the Sopranos, often deliberately concealed from public attention, could cause more long-term damage than a riot. On the other hand, family members justify both AJ and Johnny Boy's bad behavior by blaming anti-Italian discrimination. But both of them are really in trouble because of their actions. Another aspect is sexism. Silvio's daughter is outraged that her father's job involves exploiting women. Based upon what we see happen to Tracy in Season 3, it's hard to disagree with that. And one thing Tony mentions to Livia is that if she were born after the feminists, she would have been the real gangster in the family. He has a point, but Tony doesn't yet know the full extent of Livia's machinations behind the scenes, and how she's pulling Junior's strings like he's a puppet. Ironically, a lack of opportunities hasn't prevented Livia from, in fact, being the real gangster here. She's so good that her son, an experienced criminal, doesn't know what she's doing right under his nose. Tony even said to Melfi before that his mother is an old sweetie, a harmless old woman. If anything, Livia weaponizes oppression as a manipulation technique. In fact, another thing I'm reading about in Robert Hare's book on psychopaths is something called malinger, which is faking a physical or mental illness in order to avoid responsibility and make themselves into the victim. Later this season, after Junior's failed assassination attempt on Tony, Livia pretends to have dementia and be unaware of any involvement in Junior's conspiracy. Feminism may have given Livia the chance to be a woman boss, much like Annalisa in Season 2, but she doesn't need equality to be the real gangster in this family. One last detail I want to mention here, even though I almost put this in the trivia section, is that in Tony's bedroom, the painting on the wall is Samson and Delilah by Francisco Morone, a Renaissance artist from Milan who painted this in the 16th century. The story of Samson and Delilah is from the Book of Judges, about Samson, who has superpowers given to him on the condition that his hair is never cut. But he's betrayed by Delilah, who cuts off his hair in his sleep, which leads to his doom. And during this rewatch, I wondered if this painting were meant to be an allegory for Carmela and Tony, or Livia and Johnny Boy, especially since Tony mentions in the pilot episode that Livia wore his father down into a squeaky little gerbil. But on the last rewatch, I noticed that when young Tony wakes up at night and watches his parents arguing over Rocco's offer to go to Nevada, his hair is suddenly shorter compared to earlier flashback scenes. Symbolically, his mother is betraying him in the middle of the night while he was asleep, like Delilah. And much like Samson, his hair is suddenly shorter at that very moment. And in the present, when Junior and Tony are both visiting Livia, Junior notes how Tony is keeping his hair, which given Tony's thinning scalp might just be Junior BSing him. To recap the themes, there's a great question in this episode about who's responsible for the evil in the world and within a single human heart. It could be systematic racism, it could be anti-Italian discrimination, or maybe not. Some blame their parents, some blame their children, or a disease, or herself, and some people blame the individual and hold them accountable for their own choices. Pop culture. Memes. Like most episodes, there's a few memes here. When Tony tries to downplay his troublesome childhood, Livia tells him, "You only remember what you want to remember." When AJ tells Livia that the school sent him to a psychiatrist, Livia says, "That's nothing but a racket for the Jews." And when AJ mentions that Tony goes to a psychiatrist, Livia weeps and says, "I gave my life to my children on a silver platter, and this is how he repays me." Johnny Boy tells Livia that talking to her is like having an albacore around his neck, although the real quote is albatross around one's neck from the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Johnny Boy says to Livia, "Always with the drama." AJ even says this to Carmela in the final episode when she's upset at AJ wanting to join the army. Another meme is Livia saying, "That Rocco Alatorre was a real go-getter." Sopranos vocabulary. When Tony and Carmela are having a conference with the school principal and psychologist, Dr. Galani asks Tony if he physically hits AJ. Tony says no, but thinks sometimes a little tarantella is sometimes what a child needs. Tarantella is a southern Italian style of dancing, and long ago old-timers used to sometimes use the phrase "dance with a man" as a slang phrase to mean getting into a physical altercation. Tarantella in this context is an old-school way for Tony to describe physically hitting someone. At dinner, when Tony interrupts Junior, Junior proclaims that Tony treats him like he's a miserable, which is Italian-American slang for the Italian word miserabile, which means a miserable and toxic person. When discussing Carmela's uncle Lenny and his gene pool, Tony refers to Lenny as an ubazz. Ubazz is a popular Italian-American slang term that means crazy or out of your mind, derived from the southern Italian dialect word pazzo. While changing attire, Tony jokingly calls AJ goose goose, which is Italian-American slang from cucuzza, which is some kind of a squash. In slang, it's the equivalent of calling someone squash for brains. When one of the mobsters is being arrested in the 1960s flashback, one of them says, "Vaffanculo, why don't you go lock up the Melusine? They're the ones burning down Newark." Vaffanculo is Italian-American slang for the Italian curse word vaffanculo. It's an extremely profane insult that generally translates to F off or go F yourself. But I don't mean just F, I mean the F dash 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 word. And melanzane is Italian for eggplant. In this context, it's a racial slang to refer to African Americans or people of color. Christopher uses the term moulignon in denial, anger, acceptance, which is an Italian American variation of melanzane. Now, when Tony scolds Christopher about committing interstate commerce, he calls Christopher a mimouse, and I don't know what that means. I'm not sure if I'm hearing it right. I tried the closed captioning, but on the Blu-rays it doesn't actually say. I think he's trying to say something like a memaluco, which is the Italian word for moron. Sopranos trivia. Livia tells AJ that Tony stole a car when he was 10 years old. Tony is nonplussed and doesn't want AJ to hear that kind of talk, but AJ seems to find it humorous. In Season 2, he borrows Carmela's car without permission, which is often called stealing. Junior also mentions how Tony and his little crew used to steal lobsters from boats and sell them on Bloomfield Avenue. Bloomfield is the prime territory Tony asked Junior for as his asking price to back Junior as boss in Meadowlands. In the 1967 flashback, Junior tells Tony that Joey Peppertone hit 3 RBIs. Now, Joey Peppertone played for the Yankees from 1962 to 1969. If you don't know baseball, RBI is runs batted in, and it means that a run was scored when the player was at bat. So if a player hits the ball to the outfield and only makes it to first base, but another player on third base makes it to the home plate and scores a run, the batter scores an RBI. Given that the flashbacks seem to be in 1967, Junior is likely referring to the famous April 16, 1967 Yankees vs. Red Sox game. If I recall correctly, the game was a tie and they played into extra innings. And I mean extra. When Tony questions Melfi's line of work, Tony scolds her about chemical companies dumping waste into rivers. This is ironic given that in Season 6, Tony has a guy dump asbestos into a river or a pond. So much for the ducks. When Silvio mentions the strippers at the Bing are making $1,500 a week, adjusted for inflation, that's $3,045 with 16 cents in 2026. Silvio also refers to his daughters as Principessa, which is the Italian word for princess. When Dr. Galani gives AJ the ADD evaluation, he shows him Rorschach tests. Tony mentions these earlier in Denial, Anger, Acceptance, when he believes that the painting in Melfi's office is some kind of psychiatry scam. AJ also mentions South Park in the episode of Carmen Farting Fire, which aired in August of 1997. When Carmela is looking over books about ADD, Tony picks up a book called Help Me to Help My Child. This is a real book written by Jill Bloom and published in 1990. When Tony and Melfi are discussing fate, Tony mentions Leopold and Loeb. Leopold and Loeb were privileged college students at the University of Chicago who murdered one of their neighbors in 1924, thinking that they had committed the perfect crime. But they were wrong. The case was particularly infamous. Melfi tells Tony that he likes history, and that those who don't learn from it are doomed to repeat it. This is a quote from philosopher George Santayana, who wrote this in the 1905 book, The Life of Reason. When young Tony is telling Livia that he's going to the CYO to play ball, he's referring to the Catholic Youth Organization. It's still in Newark today. The Rideland Amusement Park is actually Playland Park in Rye, New York. That's where they filmed it. When the police arrest the mobsters in 1967, they call the clown Clarabelle. Clarabelle was the clown on the Howdy Doody show from 1947 to 1960. Howdy Doody was a children's show popular back in the day. When Tony's father gets out of jail, he stops by Nasto's and picks up cherry vanilla ice cream. Nasto's is a famous ice cream shop. I believe their full name is Nasto's Ice Cream, Old World Desserts. They're still there in Newark today, on Jefferson Street. When Junior visits Livia at Green Grove, Livia jokingly says that Tony must be at Overbrook State Mental Hospital. Overbrook was a state mental hospital in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. It was in operation until 2007, and the derelict buildings of the hospital were destroyed in 2018. Also, Dr. Galani mentions that AJ has 5 out of the 9 criteria for ADD according to the APA standard. APA is the American Psychological Association. Also, the DSM-4, released in 2000, introduced the notion of 3 subtypes of ADD, including hyperactive, inattentive, and I forgot what the third subtype is. I guess I never had the makings of a varsity psychiatrist. I only have a minor in psychology, so I only have a semester and a half. And I wasn't at the top of my freaking class. When Tony exercises, he watches a documentary on Midway. Tony, of course, loves history, and I'm not sure if it was intentional, but Midway was a very pivotal battle in World War II. Like Tony, I also like history, and there's a great debate among alternative history, as they call it, and many ponder if Japan's defeat at Midway was inevitable, or if the Japanese Imperial Navy could have won and possibly altered the course of history. It's a fitting part of history for Tony to watch given the debate in this episode between fate and free will. Also, Tony's father considering relocating the family from the tri-state area to Nevada always struck me as a Godfather reference, since the Corleones do in fact move from the New York area to Nevada between Godfather 1 and 2. In the 1967 flashbacks, Junior drives a 1964 Lincoln Continental, and Johnny Boy Soprano drives a blue 1966 Cadillac DeVille convertible. Music. Now there's some great music in this episode. White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane, Don't Bring Me Down by the Animals, Carrie Ann by the Hollies, and The Blue Danube is the classical song by Johann Strauss that plays at the playground, or the playland, I'm sorry. Whack count. There are no whacks this episode, so the total deaths running remains the same, 6 deaths. 4 whacks, 1 accidental death, and 1 natural death. So now, it's time for some conclusions. How did Lorraine Senna, the only woman to ever direct a Sopranos episode, do? After the prior episode Pax Soprano, we have another episode that's hyper-focused on characters, much like the episode College. There's a great deal of backstory for Tony, an exploration of fathers and sons that fittingly includes Junior, since an episode about Tony being unable to escape his past shows someone from it being his inevitable antagonist in the present. As Livia learns about Tony being in therapy, and her almost telling Junior advances the conflict between Tony and Livia and Junior. Rewatching it after all these years, I find this to be a considerably underrated and underappreciated episode. We're about halfway through season 1, and this episode forms a linchpin. These are Tony's most redeemable moments. He shares ice cream, something he enjoyed as a child alone, and he's determined to give his son a chance to escape to a better life. Even though Tony resents the cursed choices made by his parents and knows that it's too late for him to change, he chooses to be the father that he wished he had. And that's all I have for episode 7 of season 1, Down Neck. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, since I'm giving the internet my life on a silver platter, and that's how you can repay me. I'll be continuing my rewatch with episode 8, and as soon as I have it, I'll upload it for y'all. Until then, have a good one.